In 1982, 7-year-old Emily Callahan vanished while apple picking with her family, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. For 10 years, the orchard grew wild with silence, until a child's brown boot was found tucked inside a hollow tree, uncovering a buried truth that would finally lead a grieving town back to the day everything changed. The air was crisp with the scent of ripe apples and damp leaves as the Callahan family pulled into the orchard that morning in early October 1982. Emily, just 7, pressed her face to the car window, her breath fogging the glass as rows of red and golden trees stretched into the distance. She wore her favorite leather boots and a jacket with the sleeves rolled up, more interested in running between trees than in staying warm. Her mother handed her a small basket, kissed the top of her head, and reminded her to stay close. Emily had already darted ahead, giggling as she skipped through the grass, her pigtails bouncing behind her. They were the kind of family that still made time for apple picking on a Sunday, even if the drive was long and the weather unreliable. Emily's older brother, Danny, 12 and perpetually annoyed, trailed behind, half focused on his Walkman and half on the half-hearted duty of keeping an eye on his little sister. Their father, George, tried to rouse some enthusiasm by pointing out the different apple varieties, while their mother, Colleen, snapped Polaroids as they laughed beneath branches heavy with fruit. Somewhere between the 5th photo and the 7th tree, Emily wandered out of sight. It wasn't dramatic, no cries, no sudden sound of breaking branches, just a small girl following a butterfly or a squirrel or something only she could see. Danny glanced up, irritated she'd strayed again, and called her name. No answer. He tried louder, walking a little faster between rows, expecting her to pop out from behind a tree with a smile and a handful of apples. She didn't. When Colleen realized Emily wasn't nearby, she assumed she had simply followed Danny in the wrong direction, but after a few minutes of calling, her voice grew sharper. George dropped his bag and began moving faster through the orchard, while other families looked up from their baskets and began to notice something was wrong. The orchard manager was flagged down, the front gate was closed. The laughter and chatter that had filled the fields faded as the realization took hold. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the only sound that remained was the frantic calling of Emily's name and the rustling of leaves where no small feet were walking. Emily had been gone for less than 10 minutes when the orchard shifted from cheerful to chaotic. At first, no one wanted to panic. Maybe she was crouched behind a tree, inspecting a mushroom or trying to reach an apple just out of her grasp. Her mother circled the same patch of trees over and over, her voice rising each time she called Emily's name. Danny ran toward the pumpkin patch, convinced she had wandered there instead. George flagged down a group of nearby pickers, asking if anyone had seen a little girl in leather boots. Most just shook their heads. One man thought he saw her near the north fence, but he couldn't be sure. By the time orchard staff joined in, the sun had dipped just low enough to cast long shadows between the trees. The playful maze of rows now felt endless, every section looking the same, every tree offering places to hide or become hidden. They shouted until their voices were hoarse, combing the property inch by inch. A few boys with flashlights from the nearby scout troop joined the effort, and their beams of light darted across branches and brush, desperate for something, anything. Authorities arrived just after sunset. Sheriff Roy Mendel, a seasoned man in his 50s with a steady voice, took control. His first move was to secure the perimeter. The orchard was surrounded by low fencing, easily climbed or ducked under, and beyond it lay thick woods and winding trails that hadn't been maintained in years. A 9 unit was brought in before midnight, and by early morning helicopters circled above, their spotlights sweeping through the forest like slow-moving searchlights. But nothing turned up. Not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint, not even a broken branch that looked out of place. It was as if the orchard had simply swallowed her whole. The search would continue for days. Volunteers showed up with thermoses and flashlights, some taking off work, others driving in from towns over. Emily's face appeared on local news that evening, her school photo showing her bright grin and crooked bangs. Colleen sat in the orchard's entrance booth, wrapped in George's jacket, rocking back and forth with Emily's other boot clutched in her lap. It still smelled faintly of apples. By the third day, the orchard no longer smelled like apples. It smelled like damp earth, sweat, and the bitter edge of fear. The cheerful rows of trees now stood solemn and still, their branches bare in places where searchers had torn through, looking for anything that might point to where a little girl had gone. Colleen hadn't left the property. She moved like a ghost between volunteer groups, eyes swollen and distant, voice hoarse from calling Emily's name. George barely spoke, instead pouring his energy into combing the woods behind the north fence, insisting she might have slipped under the rail and wandered too far. Every snapped twig made him freeze. Every rustle of leaves raised hope, only to let it crash again. A perimeter search extended into the nearby creek beds and low hills. Divers were called in to check the small pond that served as the orchard's irrigation reserve. They found nothing, not a shoe print, not a thread of her jacket. Dogs picked up a faint scent near the south edge of the property, but quickly lost it in a patch of pine scrub, a dead end that led nowhere but deeper forest. As the hours dragged on, the search became less organized, more frantic. Groups returned empty-handed and exhausted, their voices quieter each time. By nightfall, Sheriff Mendel gathered George and Colleen in a folding chair circle behind the staff barn. He explained that daylight was critical and the team would resume at first light, but Colleen shook her head before he finished. She wasn't leaving, not until Emily was found. That evening, the orchard owner, an older man named Vernon Elkins, opened up the family farmhouse to the Callahans. It had been sitting empty since his father passed years ago, but Vernon lit the fireplace and cleared a bedroom so the family could rest, though rest never came. Colleen sat up all night by the window, staring out at the trees that now stood like sentinels, silent and unmoved. Somewhere in that orchard, she believed, was her daughter. Lost or hiding. Afraid, cold. It didn't feel like a disappearance yet. It felt like a mistake that just needed to be corrected. Morning would come, the sun would rise, and Emily would be found. That's what they told themselves, again and again, until the sky turned gray. By the end of the week, the orchard had been picked clean of more than just apples. Every row had been walked and rewalked, every patch of underbrush flattened beneath boots and search poles. Helicopters no longer circled overhead. The scent of cider and baked goods from the roadside stand had vanished, replaced by diesel from police generators and the metallic tang of hopelessness. The crowds of volunteers had thinned. Some had jobs to return to, families to care for. Others simply couldn't bear the weight of watching the same desperate search end the same way each night, with empty hands and tearful apologies. Sheriff Mendel held a press conference at the edge of the orchard that Sunday, a line of tired deputies behind him. He spoke carefully, using words like ongoing investigation and committed resources, but the tremor in his voice betrayed a reality no one wanted to name. George stood in the background, arms crossed tight, jaw clenched. Colleen didn't attend. She was inside the farmhouse, watching the trees from the front window, refusing to believe her daughter could vanish so completely from a place so open, so familiar. Emily's name was on every news channel in the state. Flyers were taped to gas station pumps and grocery store doors. Her school photo-wide eyes, missing tooth, pink hairband became a fixture of the town's landscape. But familiarity did not bring answers. Each day, without discovery, chipped away at the idea that she had simply wandered too far and become lost. The orchard had its secrets, and with every lead that fizzled and every search that turned up nothing, people began to whisper the word no one had dared say out loud that first night: abduction. Questions swirled around the orchard staff. Who had been working that day? Were all the guests accounted for? A list was drawn up, names logged, backgrounds checked. Most were cleared easily, longtime employees or regular seasonal hires. But one name stood out: Robert Hensley, a temporary hand who had been hired just 3 days prior. No one had seen him since the day Emily vanished. His file was thin, a fake address scribbled in sloppy handwriting. Deputies followed what little trail they could find, but by the time they reached the bus stop in Albany, he was already gone. And Emily was still missing. The whispers began quietly, behind church pews and over cups of coffee in the town diner. At first, they were just fragments, speculation, anxiety, finding a voice, but soon they grew louder, tinged with suspicion and dread. People began asking the kinds of questions that don't have simple answers. How does a child vanish in broad daylight? How does no one see anything? What kind of man takes a job at an orchard and disappears the same day a little girl goes missing? The focus turned toward Robert Hensley. His name barely rang a bell with most of the orchard staff. He was new, brought on during the busy season by the owner's nephew, paid under the table like a dozen others over the years. He had worked quietly, mostly alone, doing odd tasks and keeping to himself. One woman remembered seeing him sharpening tools behind the barn. Another thought she saw him smoking near the edge of the forest line. No one recalled a car. No one knew where he was staying. His file held no real information, just a scribbled name, a fake phone number, and a local reference who turned out to be a dead end. It didn't take long for suspicion to settle on him like dust on a windowsill. Sheriff Mendel issued a warrant for questioning, but it was mostly symbolic. Hensley had vanished just as thoroughly as Emily had. A bus driver in Albany thought he remembered a man with long blonde hair and a canvas bag boarding for Montreal, but no one could confirm it. Posters with Hensley's face joined Emily's on bulletin boards, though his photo was grainy and old, clipped from a minor arrest years earlier for loitering. The Callahans watched it all unfold from the quiet of the farmhouse, still unable to return home. Colleen refused to leave the orchard, convinced the place still held the answer, that if they searched one more row or walked one more trail, they'd find her. George tried to stay composed, but the silence between them grew heavier by the day. Danny, just 12, sat alone in the orchard's gift shop, fiddling with the display toys meant for children like his sister. Every time the door creaked open, he looked up, just in case. But it was never her. It never would be. Winter came early that year, dusting the orchard in frost before Halloween. By then the search had slowed to scattered efforts, mostly symbolic gestures to show the town that no one had given up completely. But privately, people had begun to move on. The local paper printed its final article about Emily's disappearance just before Thanksgiving, tucked beneath a headline about a new shopping center proposal. The Callahans, however, didn't have that luxury. Their lives had fractured into a before and after, and nothing between could hold the pieces together. George returned to work at the mill by December, though his coworkers said he moved like he was somewhere else. He barely spoke unless necessary, and avoided the break room, where whispers still floated behind coffee mugs. He was a man defined now by what had been taken from him. At home, he spent his nights fixing things that didn't need fixing. The water heater, a creaky stair, the same cabinet hinge over and over. He kept his hands busy so his mind wouldn't wander to the sound of a little girl's boots running through fallen leaves. Colleen, on the other hand, remained anchored to the past. She couldn't bring herself to touch Emily's room. The bed stayed made, the stuffed rabbit still perched on the pillow, and the closet held a row of dresses that no longer fit anyone. Every afternoon she drove back to the orchard, parked along the gravel drive, and sat there sometimes for hours just staring into the trees. She told herself she'd know if Emily was gone, really gone. She would feel it in her chest, like a light flickering out. But that feeling never came, only silence. Danny changed in quieter ways. He stopped bringing friends over, stopped talking about school. When his classmates asked about his sister, he shrugged and said nothing. He blamed himself, though no one ever told him to. He should have watched her closer, should have noticed sooner. The guilt burrowed deep, curling into something he carried quietly into his teenage years, too young to name and too heavy to set down. The house stayed quiet. Holidays passed like shadows, and outside, snow gathered along the orchard fence, blanketing a truth no one could find. By spring of 1983, Robert Hensley had officially become the ghost no one could catch. The sheriff's department followed every thread they could find, but most unraveled the moment they were tugged. Hensley had no family nearby, no known residence, and no employment history beyond a scattering of day labor jobs under fake names. He drifted from town to town, always staying just long enough to pick up a little cash before disappearing again. In one diner upstate, a waitress thought she recognized his photo, said he had come in for coffee and left a torn comic book behind, but when pressed for details, her memory turned vague. The sheriff reached out to state police, and even the Border Patrol, hoping someone had logged a traveler matching Hensley's description. A few leads trickled in reports of a quiet man fitting his build seen at a campground in Vermont, another working a fishing dock in coastal Maine, but none of them stuck. Each time deputies followed up, they were met with shrugs and long-forgotten faces. Hensley had mastered the art of fading. With no sign of Emily and no way to locate the one man who might have answers, the case slowly slid into that dreaded category, cold. The official term offered little comfort. It meant fewer resources, fewer hours, fewer headlines. For the Callahans, it felt like being told to move on while still stuck in the same nightmare. The file on Emily's disappearance was boxed, labeled, and stored with dozens of others, stacked neatly in the sheriff's evidence room like unsolved stories waiting to be remembered. At the orchard, Vernon Elkins quietly sold the business to a developer unable to bear the association. The new owners let the trees go wild, the once pristine rows now tangled and overgrown. No one wanted to visit an orchard tied to the vanishing of a child, no matter how many years passed. Colleen visited less and less but never stopped entirely. On certain fall days, she would drive out alone, walking the edges of the old fence line with Emily's missing poster folded in her coat pocket. She would pause by the trees, listening for something, anything that might fill the silence left behind. But the wind never answered, and the woods kept their secrets. By the time 1990 arrived, the Callahan house had grown quieter in ways that couldn't be measured by volume. The silences between conversations stretched longer, and laughter felt borrowed, something that didn't belong to them anymore. Emily's room remained untouched, the wallpaper faded now, her drawings still taped to the closet door, curling at the edges. The second leather boot, the one that had stayed behind that day, sat on her dresser like a monument. Colleen dusted it every Saturday. She couldn't explain why. It was just something she did, the same way she still packed an extra juice box when she packed Danny's lunches, even though he was nearly 20 and didn't notice anymore. Danny barely spoke of Emily. He kept her in a part of his mind that stayed closed most of the time, opening only in dreams or when he passed a child on the sidewalk with leather boots or pigtails. He had stopped visiting the orchard. The memories there were too sharp, too tangled with blame he still carried like a stone in his chest. George had learned to live with the silence, though it aged him in ways that didn't show up in photographs. He worked longer hours, spoke in short answers, and let the weight of what was lost fill the spaces where his daughter used to be. The town, too, had quietly closed the chapter. New families moved in, unaware of the orchard's shadowed history. The field where families once picked apples was overgrown, the barns sagging with neglect. Teenagers dared each other to walk through it after dark, whispering stories of the little girl who vanished and the man who was never found. Most didn't even know her name. Then one day, Colleen went to retrieve something from the top of her closet and noticed the boot was missing. The second one, the one that had never left the house. She searched the dresser, the shelves, the storage bins under Emily's bed, but it was gone. No one had moved it. No one had touched that room in years. She didn't tell George. She didn't mention it to Danny. She simply stood in the doorway for a long while, heart pounding, trying to tell herself there had to be a reason. But deep down, something in her shifted. It was the kind of feeling that didn't need proof, the kind a mother carries whether the world believes her or not. Something had changed. She just didn't know what yet. The summer of 1992 had been a dry one. Weeks without rain cracked the creek beds and left the local reservoir at its lowest point in years. In late September, just as the leaves began to turn, two hikers from a nearby college set out along the old ridge trail that curved behind the long-abandoned orchard. The trail had once been part of a network maintained by the state, but it had fallen into disuse and was now little more than a series of narrow paths swallowed by tall grass and young trees. The drought had peeled back parts of the land that hadn't seen daylight in decades. They moved slowly, half expecting to stumble onto a deer path or a rusted tractor, but what they found instead stopped them cold. It was a tree large, old, and split at the base, hollowed out by time and rot. The opening was narrow, just wide enough for someone to peer inside. One of them crouched down, holding a flashlight against the dark wood. At first, it looked like nothing more than animal bedding and debris, but then the light caught on a splash of faded brown. Nestled deep in the hollow, tucked awkwardly beneath layers of dried leaves and brittle pine needles, was a small leather boot. The color had dulled with age, and the heel was curled inward slightly, but the shape was unmistakable. They didn't touch it. They stood in silence, unsure what they were looking at, but both felt the same slow chill crawl up their spines. Something about the way it sat there, still and forgotten, made the air around them feel heavier. They marked the spot and hiked back down, reporting the find to the sheriff's office later that afternoon. The deputy who took the call listened politely, but when the description of the boot came through child-sized, brown, worn, his tone shifted. Within an hour, Sheriff Mendel himself was on the trail, accompanied by two crime scene techs and a photographer. When they reached the tree and confirmed the boot was real, time seemed to bend. 10 years of dust-covered memories came rushing back. The techs began to work, carefully documenting the scene. Sheriff Mendel stood just beyond the tree line, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't say it out loud, but he didn't have to. Everyone present knew exactly what they were looking at. Emily Callahan had never left that orchard. Not really. The boot was carefully removed from the hollow with gloved hands, its leather surface stiff and brittle from years of weather and decay. Time had dulled the once bright brown leather to a muted, almost rust-colored hue, but there was no mistaking it. It matched the exact brand and style Emily Callahan had been wearing the day she disappeared. The sole bore the faint outline of a sticker, long peeled away, and one of the loops at the top was still intact, as if waiting for a small hand to tug it on again. Forensics sealed it in a protective bag, while investigators swept the surrounding area. The soil around the tree was dry and packed. A few fragments of cloth turned up nearby, faded and frayed, colors barely discernible. A small button, possibly from a child's coat, was tucked among the leaves a few feet from the base. Everything was flagged and catalogued. The team worked slowly, not because the site was large, but because of what it represented. It wasn't just evidence. It was a gateway back to a day the town had tried so hard to bury. Sheriff Mendel called George and Colleen personally. He didn't trust anyone else to deliver the news. Colleen answered, her voice cautious, as if she were already bracing for something. When he told her about the boot, there was a pause too long, too still. Then, the sound of her breath catching, like something folding inward. She didn't cry, not at first. She only asked if it was hers, if it was really Emily's. Mendel said they couldn't be certain yet, but they believed it was. She didn't ask what else they found. George drove to the sheriff's office that evening. He sat in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before going inside. He didn't ask to see the boot. He didn't ask for photos. He just wanted to know where they found it, which part of the orchard. When Mendel told him, George nodded once, quietly, then walked back to his truck and sat behind the wheel with his hands clenched on the steering wheel until night fell. Across town, Colleen stood in Emily's room, staring at the empty space on the dresser where the second boot had once rested. Without even touching it, she had known something was coming. Now she just didn't know what came next. News of the boot spread faster than anyone expected. By the following morning, it was on the front page of the local paper with a grainy photo of the hollow tree and the headline that no one could ignore. 10 years after she vanished, a clue had surfaced. Something real, something touched by Emily. The photo of her school picture appeared again in windows and on bulletin boards, and suddenly it felt like 1982 all over again. People who had been children when she vanished were now adults, and they remembered. The orchard's shadow crept back over the town. Calls poured into the sheriff's department. Old witnesses, curious reporters, people who had been at the orchard that day. Some claimed to remember things they had never mentioned before. One woman said she saw a man near the edge of the orchard, standing by a truck with no license plate. Another recalled hearing a child cry near the woods, but assumed it was nothing at the time. Most of it was noise too late, too blurred by time, but the department logged it all. For the first time in a decade, the case file was reopened and placed on a fresh desk. The Callahans didn't speak to the press. George declined interviews. Colleen stayed inside, drawing the curtains and letting the phone ring. They had lived with this grief in silence, and now it felt like strangers were picking through it, hunting for drama, for answers, for something to make sense of what had never made sense to them. Danny, now 22, came home from college without saying why. He didn't ask questions. He just sat at the kitchen table one morning and said he wanted to help. His parents didn't need to ask with what. At the site, investigators combed through the forest surrounding the tree with cadaver dogs and metal detectors, mapping out a 100-foot radius in every direction. Every scrap of fabric, every hairline crack in the bark, every shallow depression in the ground was marked. Most of it led nowhere. But the boot had been real, untouched by weather, in ways that suggested it had been sealed inside the tree since the day Emily vanished. It hadn't washed in, it hadn't fallen, it had been placed, and that realization changed everything. The boot was sent to the state lab within hours, sealed in a climate-controlled container to preserve any trace of what time hadn't already stolen. The techs handled it with precision, peeling back layers of dirt and leaf matter to expose the fine cracks in the leather, the slight warping of the sole. They examined every crevice for fibers, hairs, anything that might have survived inside the narrow shelter of that hollow tree. Most evidence was long gone, washed away by years of damp seasons and insect decay. But not all of it. Tucked along the interior seam, in a spot barely visible to the eye, was a smudge of residue, a faint fingerprint. It was partial, worn down by time, but the lab was able to lift it and begin the slow process of cross-referencing it against old records. Back in 1982, fingerprinting technology had been limited, and the files were mostly paper, but by 1992, digital databases had taken root, and the system flagged a potential match. Robert Hensley. The name hadn't been spoken aloud in years, not officially. His file had been pushed to the back of a locked cabinet, marked inactive when no new leads surfaced. But now, with the fingerprint linking him to the boot, the case shifted. He was no longer a figure of suspicion. He was a person of interest with forensic evidence connecting him directly to the scene. Sheriff Mendel stood in the station's briefing room, holding the lab report in one hand, his other clenched tight at his side. He didn't feel triumph. He felt weight. There was no guarantee they'd find Hensley now. A decade of absence left too many places for him to hide, but it was something solid to chase. The sheriff called his contacts in Vermont and Maine, places where Hensley had once been rumored to pass through. A bulletin went out to agencies across state lines. His name was re-entered into the system, flagged as active. Wanted for questioning in connection to the Emily Callahan case. Colleen sat on the porch when she heard the news, rocking gently, the newspaper folded on her lap. She didn't say anything, just stared into the trees across the road. For the first time in 10 years, someone knew something. And maybe, just maybe, that meant the silence was about to end. The orchard, long forgotten and left to the wild, became the center of everything again. A forensic team was dispatched to revisit the site around the hollow tree, this time with cadaver dogs, soil probes, and ground-penetrating radar. The grass was high and matted, the barn sagging inward, and the rows of trees overgrown into a bramble of branches and vine. But beneath the decay, something still lingered, hidden just below the surface. They expanded the search zone beyond the tree, carefully combing the forest floor in a tight grid. Near the base of a nearby oak, partially buried under decades of leaves and soil, a tech found a scrap of cloth. It was dull blue, soft like cotton, and the edge bore the faint outline of a flower print, something meant for a child. About 10 feet from the fabric, another fragment was discovered, smaller this time, a snap button still attached. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt still, thick with the weight of the past. Sheriff Mendel stood at the edge of the site, watching the markers multiply as more pieces surfaced. They were careful not to make promises. The evidence needed testing, but in his gut, he knew. This wasn't just random debris. These were the remains of a story that had been waiting to be found. Back at the lab, the fabric samples were examined under magnification. Dirt and mold clung to the fibers, but enough material was intact to extract a partial DNA profile. The techs requested a known sample from the family. Colleen provided a sealed baby tooth she had kept tucked inside a jewelry box since Emily's first visit from the tooth fairy. It was small, stored in a glass vial, with her name in neat script. When the comparison came back, it was conclusive. The fabric near the tree had belonged to Emily Callahan. News of the discovery spread quickly. Local stations carried it, and by evening, state outlets had picked up the story. George watched the report from the living room in silence, remote resting in his lap, the volume low. Upstairs, Colleen sat on Emily's bed, one hand pressed against the wall beside the closet where her drawings still hung. They had always said they needed closure. But now, with every new detail, it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like an opening, and they had no idea what would come through next. Danny returned to the orchard for the first time since he was 12. He hadn't planned to. He'd told himself there was nothing to gain from going back, nothing there that could undo what had happened. But after hearing about the boot, the cloth, and the fingerprint, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was a quiet, gnawing sense that he might have seen something back then, something important, something he didn't understand at the time, but maybe could now. He walked the overgrown paths slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the trees like they might speak if he listened hard enough. The air was thick with memory. He passed the old fence line where he last saw Emily dart off between rows of apple trees, chasing something, maybe a butterfly or her own imagination. The guilt he'd buried for a decade rose up again, sharp and immediate. He had been annoyed that day, impatient. He didn't want to babysit. He wanted his music and his space. He'd looked away for only a moment. Just one. Near the back edge of the orchard, he stopped. There was a tree there, not the hollow one from the discovery, but another nearby. Something about it pulled at him. He remembered sitting there that day, waiting for his parents to realize Emily was gone, and how in that silence he'd noticed a man standing just outside the fence. He hadn't thought much of it then. Just a figure, a shadow. The man had leaned against a truck, arms crossed, watching the trees. Danny never told anyone. Not because he meant to hide it, but because it hadn't felt important until now. He walked back to the sheriff's office that evening, unsure if what he remembered would help. But when he described the man's hair, long and pale, and the way he stood, still and detached, Sheriff Mendel's eyes locked onto his. He pulled out the only surviving photo of Robert Hensley. It was grainy, taken years before the orchard, but the moment Danny saw it, his stomach dropped. It wasn't just a guess, it was him. And, for the first time since Emily vanished, Danny felt something that bordered on clarity. A detail he had carried without knowing. A shape in the dark, finally stepping into light. Sheriff Mendel brought in a sketch artist the following morning. Danny sat in the small conference room for nearly an hour, eyes closed, trying to summon every fragment of the memory. He described the shape of the man's face, the way his jaw was narrow and his eyes seemed sunken. The hair had been long and stringy, pale blonde like straw, and he wore a green flannel shirt with one sleeve rolled higher than the other. What struck Danny most, all these years later, was the way the man hadn't moved. He had stood by the truck without shifting his weight, without looking around, just staring into the orchard like he was waiting for something to come to him. The artist sketched quietly as Danny spoke, only asking a question now and then to clarify a detail. When the drawing was done, it felt like a punch to the chest. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. It looked like the man from that day, the one Danny had tried not to think about for 10 years. Sheriff Mendel took the sketch and pinned it to a bulletin board alongside the photo of Hensley. The resemblance was undeniable. They printed copies and circulated them across the state. Deputies visited halfway houses, labor halls, and small towns up north, where drifters often passed through. The new sketch triggered a memory in a retired park ranger in Vermont who said a man resembling the drawing had come through the area in the late 80s asking about abandoned cabins. Another tip placed him at a roadside motel in Maine a few years after that, using a different name but matching the physical description. Each sighting added another thread, pulling Hensley's ghost-like trail into sharper focus. Meanwhile, the orchard continued to give up pieces of the past. A cracked plastic barrette, pink with a faded cartoon sticker, was found caught in the roots of a tree just beyond the hollow. It matched a set Emily had worn in her school photo. Colleen was shown the item in person. She didn't need DNA or confirmation. She had bought that barrette herself, tucked it into Emily's hair the morning they went apple picking. And just like that, what had been only shadows and fragments began to take shape. Emily's story was no longer just a question lost in time. It was returning, slowly, painfully, but with purpose. The evidence board in the sheriff's office had grown from a few yellowed files to a sprawling display that covered nearly an entire wall. Photos, maps, sketches, and timelines were pinned in neat rows, crisscrossed with string. At the center, printed in bold block letters, was the name Robert Hensley. The fingerprint from the boot, Danny's identification of the sketch, the cloth matched by DNA, the barrette, all of it pointed in the same direction. The only thing missing now was the man himself. Detectives expanded their search to the surrounding states. They dug into hospital records, work permits, and rental logs, looking for aliases or inconsistencies. The strange thing was, for someone with no real roots, Hensley had left faint impressions everywhere. A lumber yard in New Hampshire reported a man who used the name Richard Hensley but disappeared after a week. A bait shop in coastal Massachusetts remembered someone similar, working under the table and living out of a van. Each time, he was gone before questions could be asked. It was like he was always one step ahead, as if he knew someone would eventually come looking. But there were gaps, years where no one could place him, no sightings, no work records. Investigators began to suspect that Hensley had help, or at the very least, a place he returned to, somewhere off the grid. The cabin theory resurfaced. Back in 1983, there had been a rumor of him squatting in an abandoned hunting cabin near the Vermont border, but the location had never been verified. With the new leads, a search team was dispatched into the dense forests outside Middlebury, following old fire roads and topo maps marked with logging trails no longer in use. 3 days in, they found it. The cabin stood alone in a clearing, its windows boarded and the roof sagging under decades of snow and rot. Inside, the walls were covered with peeling newspaper clippings and torn magazine pages. In one corner, an old mattress lay on the floor, covered in mildew. But tucked in a wooden crate beside it was something far more unsettling: children's items. A doll missing its head, a stained pillowcase. A stack of drawings, some clearly done by a child, and wedged between two floorboards, wrapped in plastic, was a journal. Whatever it contained, Sheriff Mendel knew before opening it that it would not be easy to read, but it might finally tell them what happened in that orchard and why. The journal was worn, the pages yellowed and stiff with age, the cover a cheap faux leather that had started to crack at the spine. Sheriff Mendel opened it slowly, careful not to tear the binding. The handwriting inside was tight and angular, written in dark ink that had bled slightly into the paper over time. At first glance, it read like the ramblings of someone living far too long in isolation. But as he flipped through the entries, a pattern began to take shape: dates, locations, and references to children that sent a chill through the room. There was no mention of Emily's name, but Mendel didn't need it. One entry, dated just days after her disappearance in 1982, referenced the girl from the orchard and a note about her small voice echoing through the trees. The language was cold, almost clinical, stripped of emotion. Another page included a sketch of what appeared to be the same hollow tree where the boot had been found, labeled with measurements and scribbled notes. The surrounding pages shifted between fragments of thought and detailed lists, types of candy, bus routes, color combinations for hair ribbons. It was clear Hensley had been watching, tracking, and planning for longer than anyone had realized. The journal spanned nearly a decade, though the entries became more erratic after 1986, filled with paranoia about being followed and passages that drifted into incoherent spirals. It seemed he had returned to the orchard in the years following the disappearance, convinced no one would ever find what he had hidden. That was the word he used: hidden. Never lost, never gone, hidden. Sheriff Mendel photocopied every page before handing the journal over to state authorities for analysis. He didn't share its contents with the Callahans, not yet. Some truths, he believed, needed time to soften before they were spoken out loud. But he did sit with Colleen and George that evening and told them, gently, that they were closer than they had ever been. Closer to answers, closer to knowing. Colleen listened with her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the corner of the living room where Emily's dollhouse still stood. George didn't say anything at all. He just nodded once and stared out the window, the orchard in his mind no longer full of apples, but full of shadows, finally beginning to lift. The theory surrounding the hollow tree began to crystallize as investigators pieced together entries from the journal with forensic findings from the site. It wasn't just a convenient place to hide something, it had been chosen deliberately. According to one passage, Hensley had spent weeks mapping out spots along the orchard's edge, studying the terrain, memorizing where the forest began to thicken and where sound no longer traveled easily. The tree, tall and misshapen with a hollowed-out base, had been marked with an X in his notes. It was described as a quiet pocket, a place where things could be left behind without being found. Forensic analysts returned to the orchard with equipment more advanced than what had been available a decade earlier. Soil samples from inside the tree confirmed a pocket of organic decomposition, but too degraded to yield any tissue remains. Still, trace elements of hair and fabric fibers consistent with earlier findings were pulled from beneath the bark. It was enough to confirm that Emily had been inside that tree, likely placed there the day she disappeared. What haunted everyone involved was the implication that she may not have died immediately. Some entries in the journal hinted at fear, noise, then silence. Sheriff Mendel kept that part to himself. The official statement was measured, careful, designed to protect the family from the most devastating interpretations. Emily's remains had not been recovered. No body, no definitive cause of death. But what they had, what now lived in reports and sealed evidence bags, painted a picture no one could ignore. Hensley had taken her. He had hidden her in that tree. And then he had walked away. Colleen returned to the orchard on her own a few days later. She didn't go to the hollow tree. She stood instead by the edge of the fence where Emily had last been seen and let the breeze move around her. The trees had grown wild, their branches twisting into one another, but she could still trace the shape of that October day. She closed her eyes and whispered her daughter's name once, not loud, not desperate, just present. For the first time in 10 years, it didn't echo back empty. Something had shifted in the air. Something settled. Not peace, not yet, but something close. The discovery of the journal had changed everything, but it also left the town with a deeper kind of unease. People had spent a decade believing Emily had vanished into thin air, taken by someone who disappeared just as suddenly. But now they knew she had been hidden in plain sight, her final resting place no more than a few hundred yards from where volunteers had stood shoulder to shoulder, calling her name. That hollow tree had witnessed it all: the search parties, the prayers, the passing of seasons, and had kept its secret without so much as a sound. Experts were brought in to study the structure of the tree. It was an old maple, its base widened from rot, creating a natural cavity large enough to hold a child. The opening had been narrow and partially obscured by thick underbrush. In the early stages of the original search, it might have looked like just another tangle of roots and decay. But the real revelation came when a botanist studying the surrounding trees noticed something odd. Growth patterns near the hollow had been disturbed around 1982. A limb had been broken, intentionally wedged across the opening, then left to grow back around itself, disguising the cavity further. Someone hadn't just used the tree, they had sealed it. Sheriff Mendel stood beside the tree as the team explained it, his hand resting on the trunk, his thoughts drifting to the image of Emily's boot, small, brown, and patient, waiting in the dark for 10 long years. It chilled him to think of how close they'd been. One more glance in the right direction, one more step off the trail, and maybe things could have been different. But that kind of thinking didn't help anyone now. What mattered was what came next. Danny had returned to the orchard again, this time with his parents. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, not speaking much, but watching the tree from a distance. There was no ceremony, no reporters, no public statement. Just the three of them and the wind. George reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the second boot, the one they had kept all these years, and set it gently at the tree's base. Colleen placed a small apple beside it, polished clean. They stayed there until the sun dipped low, their shadows stretching long across the grass. The old case files were pulled out of storage, their paper edges yellowed and curled from years in a dusty archive room. The evidence logs were updated. Witness statements were reviewed, and interviews from the fall of 1982 were retranscribed. A new team of investigators, younger and armed with better tools, took over the finer details of the search for Hensley. They worked methodically, tracking down every name from the orchard's employee list, cross-referencing them with transit records, utility bills, even old motel registries. A case once built on memory and rumor now leaned on data and persistence. Then, in late October, nearly a month after the journal was found, a detective in Maine noticed something buried in a recent report from a small coastal town near Bar Harbor. A transient man had been arrested for shoplifting canned goods. He gave a false name and refused to provide ID. The officer had taken fingerprints, as required, but the prints hadn't yet been processed until the detective called and pushed them through. Hours later, the match came back. Robert Hensley. It was almost surreal how ordinary the arrest had been. No chase, no resistance. Just a man in a threadbare coat and worn boots caught slipping food into a backpack. He was held in a small county jail, unaware that his prints had triggered a cold case a decade old and 100 miles away. Sheriff Mendel received the call just after midnight. He didn't wake the Callahans right away. He waited until morning, until the light had returned and the sky had softened from black to pale gray. When he knocked on their door, George answered. Colleen was already in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with her hands clasped. Mendel didn't speak right away. He took off his hat, held it in his hands, and said quietly, "They found him." Colleen's breath caught, just for a second, and then she nodded, as if confirming something she already knew in her bones. Out on the lawn, the wind moved through the trees, shaking loose the last of the season's leaves. They drifted to the ground like pieces of a story finally being laid to rest. Not finished, not yet but no longer lost. Hensley sat in the holding cell like a man who had been waiting for this moment all along. He didn't speak when they fingerprinted him again, or when they read him his rights. His eyes were flat, tired, almost vacant, but his posture never slouched. He answered basic questions with clipped yeses and nos, but when asked about Emily Callahan, he stared straight ahead and said nothing. Sheriff Mendel drove up the coast with 2 deputies to oversee the transfer personally. The ride back was quiet. Hensley didn't ask where they were going or what came next. He watched the trees pass by through the window like he was trying to remember them, like they were the last familiar thing left in a life that had unraveled long ago. Back in town, news of the arrest moved quickly. People who had all but forgotten the details of the case now found themselves whispering them in grocery store aisles and church foyers. Some expressed relief. Others asked why it had taken so long. A few still weren't sure what to believe. But for the Callahans, the talk didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that the man who had taken their daughter was no longer just a name on a file. He was real, and he was finally going to answer for it. Colleen didn't go to the station. She stayed home, pacing quietly through the rooms of her house, pausing often in the hallway outside Emily's door. George went, though. He stood behind the glass as Hensley sat motionless in the interrogation room. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then, in a low voice, he asked why. Not how, not when, just why. Hensley looked up for the first time, and something flickered in his expression. Not remorse, not fear, something colder, more distant, like he wasn't even part of the memory anymore. He gave no real answer, just a quiet shrug, like the question didn't deserve one. Later that night, George sat alone in his truck outside the orchard, headlights off, the trees rising like sentinels in the dark. He had imagined this moment for years, but now that it had arrived, it didn't bring peace, it brought weight. Heavy and still, like the orchard itself, waiting for something more than justice. Waiting for truth. Hensley didn't confess right away. For days, he sat in silence during questioning, offering only blank stares or vague shrugs when detectives pressed him. He denied involvement, then claimed he didn't remember, then refused to speak altogether. But the evidence had already begun to close in around him. The fingerprint from the boot, the journal found in the cabin, Danny's identification of his face, the timeline of sightings stretching across New England. It wasn't a matter of if anymore. It was when he would break. It happened on the 5th day, not in the interrogation room, but during a transport between holding facilities. The deputy driving mentioned the orchard in passing, not as a tactic, but as idle conversation. Something in Hensley shifted then. He looked out the window and said, almost absently, that he never meant for her to scream. The deputy glanced over, unsure if he'd heard right. Hensley didn't elaborate, but it was enough. Enough to bring him back into the room under new conditions, enough to begin a quiet unraveling. Piece by piece, the story emerged, not with remorse, not with sorrow, but with detachment, like he was recounting someone else's actions. He had seen Emily from a distance that morning, noticed how freely she moved between the trees. He hadn't planned anything specific. He said that several times, as if trying to make it sound less cruel. But he'd waited near the edge of the forest, knowing children sometimes wandered when parents weren't watching. He had lured her with something small, something bright in his hand, a toy or a ribbon. When she followed, he led her deeper into the woods. She became afraid. She started to cry. He panicked. Claimed he hadn't meant to hurt her, only to quiet her down until he could think. When she stopped moving, he didn't know what else to do, so he placed her inside the hollow tree and walked away. He described the way the tree felt cool inside, how he had broken a branch and wedged it across the opening like a seal. Then he left, boarded a bus the next day and didn't look back. Sheriff Mendel listened in silence, recording every word. When it was over, he stood and left the room without looking at Hensley again. Outside, the sky had turned gray and heavy, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like it might rain. The town held its breath as news of the confession spread. It wasn't announced publicly, not at first, but people always found out. A clerk at the courthouse whispered to a neighbor, who told her sister, who told someone standing in line at the bakery. By evening, the silence that had hovered over Emily's case for 10 years was replaced with a quiet murmur, the kind of collective exhale that comes not with relief, but with recognition. The story had an ending now. It wasn't the one anyone hoped for, but it was no longer unfinished. At the Callahan house, the atmosphere felt suspended in place. Colleen sat in the living room with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on a spot just past the television. George stood at the kitchen sink, running the faucet without using the water, lost in thought. Danny paced quietly upstairs. No one said much. The weight of finally knowing pressed on them in a way they hadn't prepared for. Answers had always seemed like they might bring closure. Instead, they brought clarity that hurt. Later that week, Sheriff Mendel visited the house one last time, this time not with news, but with paperwork. The case would go to trial. Hensley had been formally charged. There was enough evidence to ensure he would never walk free again. Mendel didn't stay long. Before he left, he handed Colleen a small envelope. Inside was a copy of the sketch Danny had helped create, a few pressed leaves from the base of the hollow tree, and a note written in the sheriff's own hand. It said only, "You never stopped looking." Outside, the trees had begun to change. October had returned, and with it, the same gold and crimson canopy that once blanketed the orchard. George suggested they go back, just the three of them, not for the press or the town or to be seen, just to say goodbye. The next morning, they walked the trail that led to the hollow tree. It stood as it always had, tall and silent, a witness to everything it had once hidden. They stood together at its base, side by side, and for the first time in 10 years, they didn't feel like they were waiting for something. They simply stood in the moment, still and whole in their grief. The trial didn't last long. The evidence was overwhelming, and Hensley's quiet, dispassionate confession removed any remaining doubt. He didn't argue or protest, didn't try to explain himself. He simply sat there, pale and motionless, as the charges were read aloud. The courtroom was packed, but still, the silence felt louder than any words spoken. Members of the jury watched him with unreadable expressions, some visibly struggling to maintain composure. Others kept their eyes fixed on the table in front of them. The judge moved swiftly, wasting no time on drawn-out proceedings. The verdict was unanimous, the sentence immediate life without parole. Colleen didn't attend every day of the trial. She had said from the beginning that she didn't need to hear it all again, not from his mouth. George went, though. He sat through every word, every evidence presentation, every witness statement. He said little afterward, but when it was over, he returned home with a copy of the court transcript tucked under his arm. He didn't open it. He just placed it on the shelf beside the photo of Emily in her second-grade dress, and then he sat beside his wife, and they held hands for a long time without speaking. Danny gave a statement to the court. He stood with quiet resolve, his voice steady despite the ache behind it. He didn't talk about guilt or blame, only about memory. About what it meant to carry someone with you, even after they were gone. He ended his statement by saying that Emily had never left his side, not once, and that this wasn't the end of her story. Just the end of the part that hurt the most. The town moved forward carefully, as if afraid too quick a step might erase what had finally been uncovered. The orchard remained closed, but the county agreed to place a small memorial near the hollow tree. Nothing elaborate. Just a wooden bench, a plaque with Emily's name, and a single line beneath it. She was loved. She is remembered. That fall, leaves blanketed the orchard again. Children rode their bikes past the gate. Parents held their hands a little tighter, and life, in its quiet and imperfect way, began to fill the spaces that sorrow had once held. On a quiet morning in late November, Danny climbed into the attic of the Callahan house with a cardboard box marked with his sister's name. The sun filtered through the narrow window, casting long slants of light across the dust. He moved carefully, not out of fear, but reverence. Inside the box were pieces of Emily's life drawings, a faded stuffed rabbit, birthday cards she'd made for their parents with crooked handwriting and stickers. At the bottom, wrapped in a soft flannel sheet, was the leather boot they had recovered from the hollow tree. He held it for a long time, his thumb tracing the curve of the sole, the place where the heel had worn slightly from her walking. It didn't feel like evidence anymore, it felt like a part of her. A part that had come back. Downstairs, Colleen baked bread like she used to on Sundays, the smell curling through the house in gentle waves. George was in the garage, repairing a loose shutter, even though it was colder than it should have been to work outside. None of them spoke about what came next. They didn't need to. Life had begun to flow again, not with ease, but with rhythm. Grief had carved out its space, and now love was beginning to grow around it. Later that afternoon they drove together to the orchard. The trail was still soft with leaves, the kind that made everything feel muffled, as if the world itself had paused to listen. At the memorial bench they sat without speaking, just letting the stillness settle around them. Colleen placed a photograph of Emily on the plaque. Danny, without a word, set the leather boot beside it. For a long time, they stayed there, watching the trees sway. There was no dramatic ending, no sudden release, just a quiet, aching kind of peace. The kind that comes not from forgetting, but from remembering with gentleness instead of pain. When they finally stood to leave, the wind picked up, lifting a few leaves into the air, spinning them in slow, lazy circles. The boot remained where it had been placed, not buried, not hidden, just resting in the light, exactly where it belonged.